Connections Life and History, Dr. T. David Gordon. We have spent an enjoyable weekend under his instruction and under his ministry as he has given us good tools to make the book of Psalms that much more accessible to us, whether publicly and congregationally or in terms of our own reading of the Psalms for our own private edification and expressions of devotion. And so now I suppose in order to practice what he has preached, he is going to preach to us from the Psalms and I suspect model for us those things that we have been learning over the past few days. So Dr. Gordon, please.
Thank you, Jeff, and Deacon and Elder and congregation, all of you, for receiving me cordially again in Kansas City. Whenever I'm here, I don't feel so much that I've left home, but that my family's not with me, because I always feel that this is part of my home, and that fellowship that we will enjoy interminably in the life to come is always a delight to enjoy on occasion with you. And so thank you for always making me feel so much at home when I'm with you. Our text this morning is the 75th Psalm. At least among its other virtues, it's easy to find. The Psalms are in the middle of the Bible, and Psalm 75 is in the middle of the 150 Psalms. And so it's not a difficult one to find, and I hope it will not be entirely difficult for us to grasp. And so I will turn your attention to the 75th Psalm. I'm happening to read from the English Standard Version that appeared last fall, and I'm very delighted with it overall as a translation. I think it's a very fine one. I'm very pleased and thankful to God that it's available to us. And so hear the word of God. We give thanks to you, O God. We give thanks for your name is near. We recount your wondrous deeds. At the set time that I appoint, I will judge with equity when the earth totters and all its inhabitants. It is I who keep steady its pillars. I say to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not lift up your horn, or speak with an insolent or haughty neck. For not from the east or from the west, and not from the wilderness comes lifting up, but it is God who executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another. For in the hand of the Lord there is a cup of foaming wine well mixed, and he pours out from it, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs. But I will declare it forever. I will sing praises to the God of Jacob. All the horns of the wicked I will cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be lifted up. Harrison Smith has been very generous to let me enjoy his bedroom this weekend. And I couldn't help but notice that on the walls are 3 posters of Derek Jeter. Learned a couple things from that, didn't I, Harrison? I learned that you like Derek Jeter. What else did I learn about what Harrison likes, in addition to Derek Jeter? Baseball. You can't admire Derek Jeter unless you love baseball. Had Harrison had 3 posters of Beethoven on the wall, I would have also known 2 things. That Harrison loves Beethoven and that he loves music. And that he's an unusual young man. It's the nature of admiration that we can only admire those of admirable character or those whose works we admire. Israel, in her psalms of praise and her psalms of thanks, expressed her admiration for God. And in the case of the psalm before us, for his deeds. We give thanks to you, O God. We give thanks for your name is near. We recount your wondrous deeds. We go on to find in this particular psalm that it is not all of God's deeds that they recount in this particular one. We think of the great works of creation, providence, redemption. It's one of those that are recounted here. And one side of the work of redemption, which we always think of in terms of grace and judgment, oddly enough, perhaps, they rejoice in God's works of judgment. To admire God as the Israelites did, we must be able to admire this particular of his deeds, that he will judge the wicked, insolent, and proud, and that he will do so remarkably. If you look at this psalm with me, you'll note then that the challenge of it is how do we come heartily to rejoice that God will judge the wicked. It's easier, isn't it, instinctively, to rejoice that he's merciful towards those who need mercy. Easier to rejoice that he's made the world remarkably, hasn't it? Both beautiful to the eye and good for food. This one's a little harder. And so, just as our English friends come to the United States and have to forswear cricket and learn how to appreciate Harrison's baseball in order to appreciate Derek Jeter, you and I have to come to appreciate, in some hearty way, God's works of judgment in order to admire him for this. As we look at this psalm, it falls into several parts, 4 parts actually, and this particular psalm, as the thought moves across it, indicates its breaks by the movement of voice. This is not uncommon in the Psalms for the psalm to express different voices speaking at different times. So that you note in the first verse, it is a first-person plural. We give thanks. But then in verses 2 through 5, it moves to the first-person singular as God himself speaks through a prophetic oracle of judgment. The voice of God himself is represented there in verses 2 through 5. I say to the boastful, do not boast. And then the third part of the psalm appears over there in verses 6 through 8 as it moves to the third person, singular, as there is a description, somewhat more impersonally removed in the third person, not from the east or from the west, comes lifting up. And then the final, the fourth of the passages here in verses 9 through 10, returns to the first person singular, but this time it is not God speaking as an oracle through the prophet, but the psalmist himself, Israel's king, speaking, I will declare it forever. And yet there is unity to the psalm, because what this psalm says is among the great deeds of God for which we ought to admire him are not batting 325%, right? Or catching all the balls hit his way. But among the deeds of God for which we ought to give thanks and praise are that he judges. And we find in this particular psalm that God will judge the proud certainly, thoroughly, and representatively. That he will judge the insolent and the proud certainly and thoroughly and representatively. And so as we move through each of these voices, each of the 4 voices carries part of the weight of that reality. And I call your attention to it then, that as we move beyond that initial expression of general thanks that God has done wondrous deeds, we turn now in verses 2 through 5 as God himself speaks and the prophet pours out the oracle in the voice of God before us. And now we learn why it is that we should give thanks to God, and it is because he will judge the proud and insolent. I say to the boastful, do not boast. And I say to the wicked, do not lift up your horn. And note even there the lack of parallelism, because it's important. I say to the boastful, do not boast, right? And I say to the wicked, do not be wicked. It doesn't say that, does it? And I say to the wicked, do not lift up your horn. The same thing he said to the proud, right? Do not lift up your horn on high, he repeats, or speak with haughty or insolent or proud neck. And then later, towards the end of the psalm, there's the reference to the horns again, because in the ancient Near East, there were a number of figurative uses of horn, but since they were sometimes used militarily to declare and speak out across the battlefield martial tunes of retreat and attack and so forth, quite often the horn is a symbol of great military conquering power. And so those who ruled the nations around Israel and resisted God's reign therein would sometimes, as it were, lift up their horn and rejoice in their power, the way a general or a soldier might grasp the sword as the symbol of military power. They do it today, even. If you have a friend who might retire from the Air Force as a full colonel, they might give him a sword. Now, he never used the sword in battle, did he? It is still a figure, a synecdoche, a visual symbol of military power. In the ancient Near East, the horns were often this way. And so you'll note that especially this psalm records God's judgment of the proud, haughty, insolent ones who have great power and yet use it to resist God and his ways. Do not boast, he says, in your great power as you perceive it. More powerful than other puny human creatures, right? And to the wicked, he says, not generally don't be wicked, but do not lift up your horn. You see then that in this particular psalm, the focus is on those proud, insolent, haughty resistors of the reign of God, who take the powers and capacities that God has given to the human and throw it back up against him in his face as they resist him and his ways. And the Israelites think this is good. We recount thy wondrous deeds, a God who can say to the proud, do not lift up your horn. Because the Israelites know what a horrible mess has come upon our created order by those who resist the reign of God. And while also there are occasions in when a horrible mess is made through sheer human weakness and fatigue and lack of moral self-discipline, the greatest of its horrors come from the proud, those resistant to correction, those who are not meek, that become stronger and stronger like a snowball gathering strength as they resist and resist and resist and sing that way. And they think of a God who is great because he will not permit that resistance forever. But he will call them to an account and say, do not lift your horn up. And he will judge these proud certainly, you see, because verses 2 and 3 say, at the set time that I appoint, I will judge with equity. When the earth totters and all its inhabitants, chaos reigning, it is I who keep steady its pillars. Now, what's going on there? There's the appearance in actual space and time and history that the wicked and insolent and proud are just proceeding on and gaining momentum as they go, right? And it looks like God has just decided it's too much to rein back in. As though he concurred with Gordon in Gordon's cynical moments when Gordon says the lost cause, right? Nothing can be done. It's a lost cause. We're tempted to say in our cynical moments, aren't we? And it looks like the whole created order totters, like a building about to topple. And yet God holds the thing steady. It is not that he isn't going to judge. At the set time that I appoint, I will judge with equity. And so what appears to us as a creation run amok as the wicked and insolent and the proud lift up their very expressions of insolence into the face of God and defy his reign, he says, warning to them, because he has appointed a set time when he will indeed judge the earth with equity. So he will judge those prouds, certainly, so certainly that he has already picked the date, as though on the great and horrible reality of a divine PDA or calendar or desktop program of some sort, there is a day already selected. We don't know. Perhaps October 17th, 2004. We don't know. But he does. And it is written in, and it is unshakable, that on that day he will surely come to judge the wicked and the insolent. That's why it moves beyond this into the third section in verses 6 through 8 with a consideration of this in the third person. We've heard the sort of staggering, thundering oracle prophetically as God himself declares this reality. And now the psalmist in the third person reasons through our reflections on it. For not from the east or from the west and not from the wilderness comes lifting up, but it is God who executes judgment. What's he saying? This is not going to take place in the sense that those who live by the sword die by the sword, a kind of a moral equilibrium to the universe that in sort of a natural sense, oh, inevitably those who do this will be their own downfall. It's not from the east. It's not from the west. It's not in the natural order, anything in the creation that this is going to happen. It's not just built into the natural order of things, in other words. He doesn't mean that when we talk about the coming judgment of God that ultimately good will win over evil in the natural course of events. That is not what he's saying. It is not from the east. It is not from the west. It's not from as far as we can see in the one way. It's not from as far as we can see in the other. Nor from the wilderness. It is God who executes judgment. That's the psalmist's understanding of what it means, this oracle, that God will judge with equity, putting down the one and lifting up the other. And then this horrible image that we find in Isaiah and Jeremiah and others as well, in the prophetic literature echoed here in the language of the psalm, this horrible, remarkable image. For into the hand of the Lord there is a cup with foaming wine well mixed, and he pours out from it, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs. This notion of a cup, not only is the date selected, but the cup with the wine in the process of fermentation, vinegary and bitter, and he has assigned to that cup the just penalty of all sin ever committed. And there's not going to be a sip, is it? But the wicked of the earth shall drink from it and drain it down to the very dregs. What an awful and remarkable image, that he will judge the proud thoroughly to the last drop, quite literally. That the proud will not escape at all. On an appointed time, God will not only judge certainly, but thoroughly. That cup will be dry when his judgment is finished, and not a drop left in it. A horrible and remarkable, frightening image, we might say. Edward McNeil Poteet refers to this, and he refers to the proud military rulers of the ancient Near East boasting of their horn, and sometimes actually filling the horn as a vessel, because they could, and drink out of it. Doubly boasting in their great military celebratory feast of what they've accomplished. He says, against this picture of the proud, loud boasts is set in satirical contrast one that shows the hand of God, holding a cup of foaming wine, well savored with spices and piquancy of fresh pomegranate seeds. But it is no drink for a festive crowd, nor is it lifted to the lips of God. From the hands of the proud who raise their brimming horns and boast their right to lord it over their fellows, the wine vessel is struck as though Yahweh knocks theirs out of their hand. The vintage is spilled, and from the giant cup in the steady hand of God is poured a cascade into the throats of the world's boastful, till the last dregs are drowned. Thus, for the wine of pride quaffed from the honors of the wicked, there is substituted the wine of humiliation poured from the cup of God. What a remarkable, remarkable image it is. Not surprisingly, then, as the psalmist takes the psalm back to his own voice, having placed the prophetic words of God before that he will judge the wicked, and having in the third person sort of evaluated that matter of how thoroughly he will judge them, now he steps back as king of Israel and her rightful ruler and leader, who ought to lead her praise and thanks also. Now here's his comment on it. I will declare it forever. I will sing praises to the God of Jacob. All the horns of the wicked I will cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be lifted up. Now the commentators and even the translators are a little puzzled by this. They thought Yahweh was going to cut them off. And some of them actually mistranslated here, all the horns of the wicked he will cut off, talking about God. But there's no evidence from the text that this is the case. The Hebrew Bible is perfectly clear. It's the first person singular, I will cut off. And the earliest Greek translations of the Old Testament and the earliest Syriac translations of the Old Testament also put it in the first person singular. All the horns of the wicked I will cut off. He has moved in verses 9 and 10 into his own voice, speaking in the first person, and this is what he says. And he is right to say this. It reminds us of Psalm 101, verse 8, where the king recognizes his responsibility insofar as he has power even in this earthly day to be an instrument of God's judgment on occasion. There in Psalm 101, the king says, morning by morning I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord. Already, provisionally, and as a type, in the life of Israel, the Davidic monarch has the responsibility on occasion of exercising God's judgment. We see in this last portion of the psalm, that is, that God judges not only certainly and thoroughly, but representatively. He places judgment into the hands of another, and undoubtedly anticipates the work of Christ about which the Belgic Confession spoke, that God will execute his judgment one day, certainly and thoroughly in the hands of his appointed King, Christ. That he will surely do this, and he will surely do this. God will judge the proud. And we thank and praise him that he will judge them certainly and thoroughly and through his appointed representative. The wicked, with their high-handed resistance to the nature and work and will of God, who bespoil his creation and injure those who dwell with them there, will not always resist. A day will come when God will hold them accountable for the damage they have caused, and he will banish them from that garden and rescue his own from their oppression. Now we do note, however, that in this particular passage, it is not generally the wicked, but the proud that are singled out, isn't it? The haughty, the insolent, the proud, the hard-necked, those who lift the horn. And as we reflect on it, then we do have to give some attention to that reality. Our Puritan friends sometimes distinguish weakness from wickedness. They followed the Old Testament that talked about the sort of unintended sin from the high-handed sin, right? There is a distinction between those sins which we commit because we are weak and frail and yet sinful, and we wish we didn't do it, on the one hand, and those that are the more defiant, deliberate resistance to the way and will of God. And this particular psalm focuses on that latter reality, the proud. Because pride is not only a deadly sin, but as the medieval church rightly understood, the deadliest of all, and in most senses, the mother of all other sin, isn't it? Because pride is the sin of the uncorrectable, the not meek, the non-self-critical, the person beyond even self-restraint now, going full speed forward, headlong, following the will of self, and with utter disregard for the will of God. And so the psalm focuses upon them as though the central focus of all the wickedness in the world resides right back here among the insolent, the proud, and the haughty. And those are the ones who wreak havoc on the created order because disregarding God, disregarding conscience, disregarding man, they have regard neither for creator nor creature. And like a runaway train, they bolt through the crowd and cause damage and havoc wherever they go. It's a horrible, horrible reality. And you'll note then that the proud tend to run together, don't they? We have images here of them in large boasts in a group together and lifting their horns together, don't we? Because it is the nature of pride that its force and its wickedness with two together is now not merely doubled, but sometimes trebled and quadrupled. Because if something begins to restrain us in our proud resistance, the presence of someone else who says, no, go ahead, right, has the non-restraining. And indeed, the greatest evil that humans do is that which we do in groups. Because things that we would never do alone, we will do when encouraged by others. And it's that great, horrible social reality that the encouragement of others tends to be what releases our worst forms of sin that caused Reinhold Niebuhr, who is not ordinarily orthodox on every point of theology, to write his appropriately thoughtful moral man in Immoral Society. that you put a human with other humans, and sometimes certain forces take place that cause us to do evil that we would not do alone. And he says early in that volume, the limitations of the human imagination, the easy subservience of reason to prejudice and passion, and the consequent persistence of irrational egoism, particularly in group behavior, makes social conflict an inevitability in human history, probably to its very end, warning us that there is a kind of pride that it manifests itself in a group that would be rare in an individual. And as a warning to us then of the nature of that. So let's just look at that for a moment. Group pride appears in a variety of different ways. That lack of meekness, that lack of correctability that comes from the fact that it's no longer just my opinion, but the opinion of the group that I run with, that makes us exceptionally unsusceptible to correction. Nationalism is a kind of a group identity that can lead to horrible behavior. Nationalism should be distinguished from proper patriotism. It's wonderful to be grateful to God for having been put in his created order, and for that particular part of it that nourishes us and brings us to where we are. Perfectly right to love our plains or our valleys or our rivers or our oceans or the conventions of our culture that have caused us to have many moments of innocent pleasure. Perfectly proper. And appropriate patriotism recognizes that. Nationalism, however, is where we step beyond patriotism to the notion that because it's my nation, it can't possibly be wrong. Because it's been so good to me, it can't ever be wrong. And all sorts of ridiculous blindnesses come from that, don't they? Horrible realities as we look back historically and we say, how could such a preposterous evil be done? The Holocaust, the enslaving of fellow Americans for so many hundreds of years. How can these kinds of things even be there? And the answer is no individual could have ever committed such sin. This demands a group, where the group together causes us to be less self-critical than we would otherwise be. By trivial analysis, for instance, if you think of the football season coming around, when, of course, Harrison will change the posters. Find a chief, I would think, to put up there instead of Jeter. Cold day in January, football players playing. And out in the end zone, though it's 14 degrees, there's a gentleman with a C painted on his chest, and he's bare-chested. And beside him, a gentleman with an H. And beside him, a gentleman, and I use the term liberally, an I, and an E, and an F. And, of course, instead of saying, what are they doing? It's 14 degrees and blustering snow, and they're wearing no shirts, right? We say, well, this happens at football games, you know. But suppose you were driving home after watching the game with someone else. Maybe you took a break at halftime and you drive home to pick up some Cheetos. And there's a gentleman sitting out in his front yard with a red C on his chest when it's 14 degrees, and you'd surely think he's blown something, hasn't he? He would never do that alone. It takes a group. Seems like a good idea when the group goes along. And nationalism is this way. There's so much that's wonderful in any nation's heritage, especially in ours, I think, that then we have the difficulty of distinguishing the good in our heritage from the evil. And we go along with unrestrained confidence that this is the way of our culture, and therefore it must be right. And it leads us to an unrestrained, unself-critical participation at times of sin. Political partisanship is another form of group pride that is especially damaging. Political parties exist in many ways to canonize their people and demonize the others. The people in your party have no flaws or errors. And the others were the pattern by which God designed the devil. And yet most of them, taken out of that context, look like the rest of us. Mixtures of the noble and the ignoble. The image of God and the marring of that image. But political partisanship makes it very hard to sort through the one from the other And in that context, off we go with a zeal and a lack of restraint and a lack of self-criticism that we probably wouldn't exercise alone. The culture wars of our own culture strike me as being that way. The culture warriors gather together, gain momentum, with a vision towards some aspects of truth as I judge truth, and yet lose the kind of self-criticism that any human or group of humans ought to have. And before long, there's collateral damage in their culture wars on both sides. Orthodoxy can be a kind of a source of group pride, where we think of ourselves safely ensconced in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, where we can be confident that our ways and practices, our values and desires are unlike those who are heterodox. And before long, everything that our tradition has done is done with unrestrained enthusiasm. And we do not exercise that criticism that as sinners we ought to exercise. Beloved, God designed our social nature to be a joining together for the cause of good. And because you and I and all humans since Adam have had sin in them, that very cooperativeness can sometimes be, as at the Tower of Babel, a source of great evil. And we have to be alert to the fact that group identity can sometimes lead to that kind of unrestrained pride that ends up defying God in the end. Now, this passage, however, moves beyond just a description of who is judged, doesn't it? And of course, the second thing that we note here is that God will, however, one day thoroughly and certainly, and through his representative, judge the wicked and establish a most remarkable order, won't he? That's the fundamental thrust of the psalm and why the psalmist places before it as a matter of thanksgiving. The ways of the wicked, who in their groups banding together resist the ways of God, will not go on forever. It will not always be the case that the violent will threaten the peace-loving. It will not always be the case that the lovers of what is ugly will deface and destroy what is beautiful. It will not always be the case that the destructive will interrupt the activity of the creative and the constructive. It will not always be the case that children will wonder whether adults are protecting and caring for them or predators. It will not always be the case that Cain will rise up against Abel and threaten the very one whose life he should have nurtured. And as horrible as the picture and image of God's judgment is to us, it is a wonderful thing that God will put an end to the resistance to his reign and thereby create a wonderful environment free of those who resist what he is doing. We are all reasonably happy, I suppose, that the recent conflict appears to be drawing to a conclusion and that the numbers of both military and civilian casualties appear to be, at the end of the day, less than we once feared. But there shouldn't be any. And we must lament the horror of such reality. I'm not talking policy issues of whether it was just or not. That's not my point. My point is we can never be content in a world in which that's what happens. And we mustn't even deceive ourselves into thinking because we saw it on a 14-inch screen that we saw the war. If you don't hear a war, you didn't see it. Louder than any of your 4th of July fireworks and a lot closer to you. How many little Iraqi children are there, 4 to 8, 9, 12 years of age, whose evening of sleep was interrupted by a boom that virtually shook them from their beds and won't permit them now to sleep for the next 15 years? What an awful world there is, that that's the only solution to certain forms of injustice. How can we be content to live in such a world? And how can we not rejoice and give thanks that there's a God who will one day reverse that and remove it all? It's a wonderful thing that he will do. What a world that will be. In fact, there's only one reason we're nervous about it, isn't it? And that's our own sin. It's only our own sin that makes us hesitate a little bit when we say God will judge the wicked. Only our own sin, isn't it? But implicitly, our psalm addresses that matter also, doesn't it? It's the king, after all, who will be the representative who executes God's judgment. The king of Israel will get down and dirty, as it were, and accept his responsibility in an unruly world to vanquish the wicked. And just as he sees in the future that God will cut off the wicked, he says, insofar as it lies in me, I also will cut off the wicked. And only a small foretaste of the coming of Christ, who will get down and dirty by his incarnation and come into this horrible, throbbing mess of resistance to the will of God in order to make it right. And who from the right hand of God will one day come to judge the living and the dead. But how does he deal with us? This cup of the foaming wrath of God, every drop of which will be consumed, is it not the cup our Lord contemplated in Gethsemane? If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nonetheless, not as I wish, but as you. He will either pour into the mouths of the wicked that cup or drink from it the consequences of our sin. But it will one day be empty. And for us, it already is. That portion of that great foaming bowl of wine that was assigned for Gordon's sin is dry as dust. Every drop drunk at Calvary. And so judgment is not for us a fearful prospect, since that portion of the cup that was assigned to us has been emptied. And God, through his representative, will right the world, remove the wicked and insolent and proud from it, and invite into his protection and kingdom those for whom Christ drank the horrible cup. And so we may look forward to that order with utter confidence that it was not an empty thing that our Savior did on his cross, but a competent and successful thing. And he's removed from us any fear of God's wrath and judgment. And therefore we can look forward to that coming judgment. The final removal of the resistance to the reign of God from all the created order. A world without bombs shattering eardrums, without predators threatening our children, without the greedy and the wicked taking what is not theirs from others, without the destructive destroying the creativity and culture of others. And that world will exist because our God will surely judge the wicked. It is surely a great world because ours is surely a great God. We give thanks to you, O God. We give thanks for your name is near. We recount your wonders.